Good evening, folks. We're just going to let people join. Hey, good evening, Adrian. Sorry, Minister Dix, how are you doing? So we're just, we had a little technological learning curve, so we're slowly figuring this stuff out.
Sounds good.
So I think.
Hi, Barb.
Good evening, Barb. So we are live, so everybody knows. So don't say anything secret. I was hoping we'd have a moment of us with us in a practice session, but for some reason Zoom's not cooperating this evening, so I have to go live. So we'll give everybody.
Hi, Maria.
Hi, Maria. Good evening, Larry.
Hey, Arian, how you doing?
Pretty good. Yourself?
As well as can be.
Yeah. Okay, folks. So just for everybody, we will get started pretty close to 7 a.m. 7 p.m. Sharp. Not 7 a.m. That would be quite a wait. But we'll give folks a few minutes to join. So.
Okay. Are you okay with me putting on the kettle?
So for people who have just joined, we'll give it a few more minutes, probably another 2 or 3 minutes. So if you want to grab a refreshment or something, feel free. So we'll start at about one or 2 minutes after 7. Sorry. So let's give it a 30-second warning and then we'll get started.
Okay.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So welcome to our Monday night political panel. Normally, we would be at the Harrison Hot Springs Resort and Spa at week 1, day 1 of Harrison, but obviously circumstances have required us to stay safely at home instead. So this is the first time that we've ever done any sort of online panel for the winter school, so hopefully it will work out. So I just ask everybody to bear with me. I want to start off introducing myself. I'm Orion Irvine. I'm the Regional Director for the Canadian Labour Congress out here in the Pacific region, and I'm one of the staff that helps put on the CLC Winter School every year. I want to start off by acknowledging I'm on unceded Musqueam territory here in Vancouver, British Columbia, and thank you for being an uninvited guest on this land. And I encourage everybody to take a moment to think about where they're coming from tonight and learn a bit about the history of the land, the people whose land we are visitors on. Also, on a rather somber note, I just want to recognize that we lost a great family member here at the Canadian Labour Congress last week in the form of Gordy Larkin. For those that you don't know, Gordy was a longtime CLC staff rep. In fact, when I came back out to British Columbia after working our HQ for a couple of years, it was Gordy's position that I filled when he retired, and he was a stalwart at Harrison and was there for many years doing anything needed, playing guitar at the winter school, but also a great activist in the labor movement and on behalf of the NDP. I think Adrian has probably known Gordy for quite a few years and worked with him at the party for many years. So he is going to be sadly missed, and unfortunately was lost due to COVID. So quite topical for this evening. So what's going to happen tonight is I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague Amandeep, who's a regional rep, who's going to moderate the panel tonight, and she'll introduce all the panelists, and we'll do a great job. So I'm going to mute myself and go off video and hand it over to Amandeep.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amandeep Niger, and I will be the moderator for tonight's webinar, Long-Term Care, the Path Forward. And thank you for everyone for joining us today. The webinar tonight will unfold with Larry Rousseau, who is the Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. And then we'll go over to our panelists, the Honorable Adrian Dix, Minister of Health, and Barb Nederpel, who is the president of the Hospital Employees Union and also the former president of the Kamloops and District Labor Council. And joining Barb Nederpel, we are also pleased to have Tess Estil, who is a long-term healthcare worker. After we've had a chance to hear from everyone, including our panelists, we will be taking questions from you folks at home. So which means that we would be encouraging you folks to use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom. It's a little bubble saying Q&A. Please type in your question. You can do that throughout the webinar tonight, and we will be asking folks the questions at the end of the webinar. I also wanted to let folks know that we are recording this webinar tonight. It will be available in a few days at the CLC Pacific Facebook page. So you can like our page, so we'll get some new likes on there as well, so that's great. As well as this recording is also on a Facebook Live, so if you wanted to tell your friends right now on Facebook as your status update, because we are all doing something great together, you can do so. So now I have the pleasure to turning it over to Larry Rousseau. And you're on mute, Larry.
There we go. Thank you very much, Amandeep, and thank you everyone at CLC for putting on this very particular winter school. It is the new challenge, the new reality for so many of us. A lot of us are getting zoomed out, but I'd like to really thank you for having me here today. I'd like to wish everyone a happy New Year, but I don't feel as happy as I would like to, with everything that's going on, losing great friends and people to this pandemic. And we are facing an unprecedented crisis in society worldwide, and we weren't ready for it. And certainly in long-term care, I think that long-term care was caught like the deer in the headlights, and because we simply did not understand, I believe, that the public nature of a pandemic absolutely needs a totally public response, and I'll get into that. a little bit later. One thing that the pandemic has done is shown a harsh light on the inequalities and inequities that exist in our society, and especially on our most vulnerable populations. As we know, immigrants account for a growing proportion of workers on the front lines, nursing aides, orderlies, and patient service associates. 1 in 3 workers who are employed in this domain are immigrants. Almost 9 out of 10 nurses, aides, orderlies, and client service associates are women. And that includes both the non-immigrant and the immigrant categories. So as well, they tend to be more heavily racialized than the rest of the workforce. And Black and Filipino women are highly overrepresented among nurse aides, orderlies, and patient service associates. So we know, and we've heard it on the news day after day after day, that the long-term care system is failing to deliver high quality care to protect the lives of residents. I think the only piece of good news I can say is that BC, you've done probably the best job in the country so far as dealing with this pandemic. I'm not going to get into politics at this point, but certainly the fact that we have a government, that you have a government in BC that believes in public services and the importance of public services is very, very crucial to that. But there are still immense challenges. The long-term care homes are the epicenter of the tragedy for COVID. Residents have been about 80% of all COVID deaths in Canada, and most of those fatalities are occurring in privately owned for-profit long-term care homes. We have healthcare workers who are also losing their lives in LTC, and really, we cannot get the vaccine out quickly enough, but we also, the biggest challenges that we're having, of course, is getting the public to take the pandemic as seriously as it should be. I can tell you that as far as long-term care is concerned, we know that the system exploits workers, and this is happening in both the private sector and the public sector. Low wages, the lowest wages possible, little to no benefits. Certainly if you're in the private sector, that is the reality. Lack of permanent full-time employment. The reality is term employment to make sure that people only do a certain number of hours that doesn't kick them into getting benefits. Lack of paid sick leave, severe staff shortages. We've seen that we have workers who work in 2 or 3 different long-term care facilities. So they go from one to the other because they'd love to have 40 hours a week, but they can't have 40 hours a week in one institution. And there's a lack of regulations in long-term care that protects workers. So I think that just to give you a very quick, something that is quite scandalous, especially with the private sector, is that if we look at the largest private sector establishments, Extendicare, Sienna Senior Living, and Chartwell, we know that these for-profit companies collectively paid out nearly $171 million to shareholders at the same time that they received $138 million through provincial pandemic pay for frontline workers. And this is not right. And instead of giving that money out to shareholders, they needed to plow that money back into personal protective equipment, higher wages, and making workplaces safer. What we are demanding, Canada's unions are demanding that the government of Canada bring long-term care into the public health care system, and it must be regulated under the Canada Health Act. We have to provide dedicated funding for public long-term care to the provinces. And when we mean dedicated funding, we have to make sure at the same time that the funding will meet the criteria of providing long-term care that meets the 5 principles of the Canada Health Act, compliance with national standards for long-term care. So we need to have those standards in place. And that means a minimum of 4 hours of direct care per day per resident. And we know, we've heard people, we've got people telling us that they're lucky if they're able to spend 20 minutes a day with each resident. We have to immediately address the shortage of long-term care workers. It's there. We have to surge staffing through the creation of aggressive recruitment, paid training, and the offer of a well-paid permanent full-time job, which is precisely what you are doing in British Columbia as well as in Quebec, but the rest of the country has to do this as well. And we must work with unions. The government must work with unions to develop and implement a robust healthcare labor force strategy to ensure that long-term care workers have permanent full-time employment, that they have higher wages. That's how you're going to attract people into the field. You've got to pay and you've got to give benefits. You've got to have job protections. They need that job security and they need full-time employment. So workplace safety goes without saying. The long-term care sector has to work with the unions in making sure that these workplaces are safe. I can tell you that in the speech from the throne from the government of Canada, because I'm coming to you from the national perspective here, it did indicate that it would work with the provinces and territories to set these new national standards. So the provinces are pushing for more health funding from the federal government, which, you know, some people are talking as being a bit of a blank check, but we would like to see the commitment to improving long-term care from coast to coast to coast. And wrapping up, major gaps in long-term care have been exposed. So we know what these gaps are. We have to work on them. What has happened over the past, I would say, 2 and even 3 decades is that we have seen funding cuts from government. We have seen privatization, but we've also seen the implementation of management practices in both the private sector in making sure that wages are as low as possible, profits are as high as possible, and we've seen that in the public sector, a lot of these private sector practices are also implemented in order because of reduced funding, and it also has an impact on wages, etc. So we have to bring long-term care into the public system, and we have to put an end to for-profit long-term care. And if there's 2 things that you have to retain from what I'm saying, that's it. And I wish all of you a wonderful panel and a wonderful stay at the Windsor. Well, a stay. See, I'm talking like if I was right there at Harrison Springs. I do miss it. I really would have liked to be out there this year. Let's hope that maybe in 2022 we might be able to do it, but certainly in 2023. Good luck, and I'm going to be leaving you because it is getting on to about 10:15 or so in Eastern time. I'm coming to you from unceded Anishinaabe territory. So bonsoir, good evening, and good luck to all of you. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Larry, for those words. I will be passing it over now to our panelists with Minister Adrian Dix. Over to you.
You see, I unmuted there, and so thank you very much. And I'm here in Renfrew Collingwood near the Joyce SkyTrain station, for those of you who know Vancouver, and from the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And I wanted to just start by saying, you know, what a huge loss it is, particularly with COVID-19. But I think for people in the labor movement, losing Gordy Larkin under these circumstances is a really enormous loss. It is for people in the NDP as well. And knew Gordy for more years than I can remember, but I think I met him about 40 years ago. And he was a generous and great leader. And I always associated him with the CLC Winter School, with people like Ron Stipp, David Rice, and Amber Hawken, and others who have made the Winter School what it is, and have trained really a generation of labor activists. And so we're really going to miss Gordy, and we're thinking about him today in all that we do, and reflecting on the impact of this world pandemic, COVID-19, on people's lives. 1,010 people have lost their lives in BC from COVID-19 since the beginning of the pandemic. To put that in context, BC has the lowest overall mortality rates of any equivalent jurisdiction in North America, of 5 million or more residents. But even here, 1,010 people is an enormous loss. Just around 600 of them, to put it in context, have lived in long-term care when they passed away. And that's a significant number. 11 in assisted living. You can see the vulnerability of people in long-term care from that. And I don't need to tell Maria or Barb about that. We know that. And only really a small handful, 3 people have passed away in all of the independent living homes. So it's not an issue just of being a senior, but the particular vulnerability of living in long-term care, which has affected people everywhere that there is long-term care, it should be said. And that means their family members, residents, their family members, the people who work with them, caregivers of all kinds. And so we think of them today. And I am enormously proud of healthcare workers in British Columbia and what they've done during this pandemic. They have been generous and courageous and skillful and thoughtful, all the things that you would expect people in a public healthcare system to be. And it's one of the great honors of my life to be Minister of Health and work with people, including members of the Hospital Employees Union, of the Health Sciences Association, the BCGU, the BC Nurses Union, and others, and Doctors BC and others who are doing such great work. I'm going to talk about long-term care a little bit, and I think Larry's context is very much a national context. Some of the things that he said are correct nationally, but not quite as relevant to British Columbia. Some of them are. And so we'll talk about some of the details of that, including the impact of for-profit care and some of the realities around that shortly. But I just want to put in context, because this group is from BC, where we were when the NDP took office in 2017, what the situation had been, and what the consequences, and why it is important in political life and labor life to win elections and to make changes, that we can be extraordinary unions and advocates, but winning elections for working people is important beyond the ordinary. And it's especially true in this area. We all know about Bill 29 and 94, which set the pattern of what our long-term care system looks like today. Remember, in that period from 2001 to 2017, we saw essentially healthcare workers working in long-term care and other places, but especially in long-term care, have fewer labor rights than any other workers in society by government diktat. Right? A bill was dropped and passed in the legislature on one day, January the 28th of 2002. It was passed on January the 30th of 2002 and led to the direct layoff of 10,000 people, but the constant churning of contract flipping and the denial of basic rights to people. And this, of course, people often view these things in terms of what it means in terms of union management relationships. But there is no question that working people and that the largely workforce largely made up of women was profoundly affected, but also patients, right? And also residents, also people living in these sectors who lived the last years of their lives under these conditions, right? Where there was no connection between a worker, really legal connection in many cases, between a worker and the care home that they worked in. And that workers could lose their job in a blink of an eye and maybe get it back if they accepted a wage decrease. And this situation over 16 years had a profound impact, but it wasn't the only thing that had a profound impact. I just want to highlight two. There's a lot to say about these things, and I've got a few minutes here. The second is that there was almost no investment in capital in the long-term care public side. What does that mean? It means that all of the new beds that were contracted in the system were on the private for-profit or private nonprofit side, but that our public beds, which are about 1/3 of the beds in BC, had very little capital investment. That means our public beds, well, they are often excellent facilities and they've done very well in this pandemic, I would argue, represent the vast majority of beds that have multi-bed rooms in long-term care. So if you're in the circumstances that we are, I have family members who are living in long-term care. If you're in a public bed, you may have a high level of service, but you're also more likely to be in a room, even though it's your residence, not a hospital, of 4 or 6 people. And this is proud. So there was very little investment. Our public beds are very old, right? And need replacement. And that is going to be a significant capital investment to make. And the third thing is the profound underfunding of staffing, so that healthcare workers were treated badly. There was very little incentive to go into the profession, into the work. In addition to that, long-term care homes weren't funded to staff at an appropriate level. So just to put this in context, our standard, Larry talked about before, our standard was 3.36 in BC, set by the previous government. And about 90% of care homes didn't meet that standard. Were funded not to meet that standard by the government. Just to put it in context, 75 of those care homes were funded below 2.90. Now these are numbers and everyone talks about what that means. That's direct care hours. That means that those care homes were funded per resident at 7.5 hours a week below the standard the government had set for care, right? So devastating impact on the labor force, not sufficient investment in capital, and below standard staffing levels across the piece, essentially 90% of the care homes. That's what we inherited in 2017. And the people in this room, and especially representatives of healthcare unions, such as the Hospital Employees Union, which Barb is going to speak to in a second, made a profound difference. I would argue they made an enormous difference, both at the Supreme Court and everywhere else, in fighting these policies and making sure that things weren't dramatically worse in 2017 than they would have been otherwise. And they brought about the change that was necessary by leading the political fight for more than a decade in British Columbia, which the Hospital Employees Union and other unions did, and bringing the change that we brought in 2017. So that's where we were. I just want to, with the context, because this is the context that leads us into this time of pandemic and what's happened since. So what did the NDP government do? Well, we got rid of Bill 2994, and that's a pretty good thing because it re-empowered unions to protect workers. It allowed for, in many cases, the growth that we've seen in organizing in the healthcare sector, and it restored protections and ultimately wages and negotiated wages in the contracted sector to many workers. And you know, it was I don't know what Barb would say, but it was about the proudest day of my life, the day that we got rid of those 2 pieces of legislation, which had been a 15-year fight for workers and for the NDP. And so it was it was a day. Election matters is the message of that. It matters because those bills would be in place today during a pandemic if that work hadn't been done. The second thing we did was raise staffing levels. And that's a critically and important thing. So at the end of this year, we're going to meet provincial standards essentially across the piece, right? That's important. And that makes a huge difference. Thirdly, we dramatically improved senior services, adult day programs, increased home support hours, increased community health hours, which allowed some people at least to stay out of long-term care longer, because regardless of how good long-term care is, in a general sense, people are happier where they are in the community, living at home as long as possible. And those are important things. And finally, we started investing in two things: training workers, which is important, more workers, and trying to create a new generation of healthcare workers, given the impact of 16 years of Bill 29 and the impact of a lack of investment in training healthcare workers. We started to do that. And then the pandemic happened, of course, as all of you know. And I think this is where both the HEU, the BCGU, BCGU, other unions have worked together to address what is a very challenging situation. I just want to say these are some of the things that have happened in long-term care during the pandemic, because we entered the pandemic having made improvements, but having inherited a system that was really challenged. And so what do? We put in place Dr. Bonnie Henry, who I worked with on the pandemic, as you know, put in place something called a single site order, which said that workers could only work on one site. But what we did that was different than every other jurisdiction, different than Alberta, different than Ontario, different than Quebec, different than the other prairie provinces, was we raised wages when we did that. So we brought all wages up to HEABC levels. All the people in the contract sector were below that. We did as a government. And I want to just cite this number because I think sometimes people think that the impact of Bill 29, well, it sounds complicated. It's a change in the law. It happened a long time ago. To raise the wages of contracted workers to HEAB levels, the ABC levels, is $165 million a year. And there's two ways to look at that. That's what it costs the government to raise the wages to the negotiated level for care aides and for others, for nursing staff and others. Right? But that's one way of looking at it. It costs us $165 million as a government. The other way of looking at it, of course, is that all of those workers were getting paid $165 million a year under the HEABC levels, which were negotiated levels, and are I don't think extravagant, but they are what they are, they're negotiated levels. Under every year, that means 2017 and 2016 and 2015 and 2014 and so on. In other words, those workers were being underpaid by that much. And that was the effect of Bill 29. It's one way of calculating the effect of Bill 29, right? Which meant people having to work 60 and 70 and 80 hours a week to support their families and not be with their kids and all those things. So we did that. And we did a whole series of other things in terms of providing more staff. And we're currently, and so that's the response to the pandemic, ensuring that long-term care homes had PPE. And I know there's a battle over that and a challenge over that, but had PPE in our supply chain when PPE was scarce. And adding funding to buy equipment and supports, and adding funding to support new staff, and adding funding to support infection control. All those things that we did in BC that were unique in BC. And I recommend an article in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which compares what we did to other jurisdictions favorably. And so that's where we stood today. So that's where we are today. And so I wanted to set that frame because I think it's important. I just want to say, what are we going to do in the next few years? What are we committed to do? Because Premier Horgan and the election campaign committed to do a series of things, and we're already on the way to doing a series of things. First is to hire 7,000 new workers in long-term care, 7,000. Some of that is to replace existing shortages, but it's to raise up care standards again, and also to build in this time when unemployment has gone up, opportunities for workers in long-term care. It is an extraordinary plan. It's been developed working with the unions, and it means that we've already hired under that plan close to 1,500 workers of the 7,000, and we're on our way to driving for that plan to address visits by people in long-term care, but also to support long-term care in general. 7,000 new workers. Secondly, and I think this is important, a major investment in capital in long-term care. We own one in three of our beds are owned by health authorities. So they're not contracted. The other 2/3 in our public healthcare system here in BC are contracted beds. But those beds need to be upgraded. We have many care homes in the public that are health authority owned and operated that are 4 or 6 to a room, which isn't safe for infection control, but these are people's homes, or their residences. And we ordinarily don't live with 4 or 6 people we have that aren't our family in our rooms. And I think single rooms should be a standard. And that is what we're starting to do. And that's why the Premier promised a $1.5 billion investment in that. We have to address contracts, because the whole nature of the system right now has been built up to drive wages down. The only competition in the sector was not about care standards, but it was about driving wages down. So we have to change the way our existing contracts with care providers are, and work with them and work with everyone to make that happen. And those elements of it, investing in capital, investing in workers, increasing training spaces, hiring more staff, and treating our staff fairly, which means that the lifts in salaries continue in long-term care. That is the beginning of a vision for the future, where if there are differences between care homes, that what we think matters is the quality of care. Where there are differences between workers, what we think matters is that everyone should be treated fairly and in a reasonable way. And that is the basis and where our long-term care homes meet the physical standards, the capital standards, the building standards that we would expect in the 21st century. You know, it's 30,000 people live in long-term care, and it's been a hard pandemic. I want you to know that our family has someone in long-term care. They've been under what's called outbreak protocol for people in long-term care 4 times. And it's been a real struggle for them. And I know it's been a real struggle for workers. It's not unusual when you have care homes with 50 or 60 or 70 workers off sick with COVID-19, and where we have effectively asking people, of course, to stay home when they're sick, when we're talking about incredibly vulnerable people, how hard that is on workers and how hard that is on people, where normal visits in care homes have been interrupted now for 9 or 10 months. This is the reality of a pandemic, which, aside from all the political issues, is toxic for people living in long-term care. But it demonstrates why what we've done is important and what we still have to do is important in long-term care, and why we're going to continue to commit to making these kind of improvements in the coming years. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Amandeep, and hear from Maria and Barb.
Thank you, Minister Dix. I think that, you know, all of us are grateful for the NDP, you know, to be empowered during the pandemic. So we are very grateful for that. We're in really great hands. I'm going to pass it over to Barb next, who is our next panelist. Over to you, Barb.
Thanks, Amandeep. Hi, everybody. It's great to be joining you tonight from Kamloops, which is colonially known as Kamloops, and that is in the greater Secwepemc-Ulu, the unceded territories of the Secwepemc peoples. And I just really want to thank the CLC for pulling this panel together. This is a really, really important discussion, and we're really proud to be part of it. HEU represents more than 50,000 healthcare workers in this province, and about 20,000 of those healthcare workers are in seniors care facilities and agencies. And about 1/3 of our members are actually care aides. So I want to start by actually introducing one of those care aides and one of our union's leaders in long-term care, Maria Teresita Estil. Now, Tess is the chair of her local long-term care home, which is in the Tri-Cities area, and it is operated by one of the largest private care home chains in this country. And this site newly organized in 2019, and they chose to join HEU to fight for better wages and working conditions in a long-term care system that has a tremendous amount of inequity, a result of 20 years of fragmentation and privatization under the former BC Liberals, as we heard from Minister Dix. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit and what it is that we feel that we need to do to fix that. But first, I really want to invite Tess to let you know why moving to a common standard working and caring conditions is just so important for workers and for residents. So good evening, Tess. You're on mute.
Hello, good evening, Barb. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so thank you for those kind words, Barb. And okay, I am a care aide at a seniors home, and I have been working on long-term care for 9 years now. And during this pandemic, my site has 2 outbreaks. The first one was very small, but now we are in the middle of our second outbreak and it's larger. Okay, so what it's like working in a pandemic? Working in the pandemic affects us healthcare workers mentally, physically, and emotionally. When we say physically, when there is an outbreak, our workload increases 3 to 5 times more, or maybe even more. Yeah. And when I say mentally, there is a big amount of stress from the virus coming into a facility to dealing with the very upset family members and residents. And when I say we deal with it emotionally, when you are both physically and mentally tired, you become emotional and it can impact the delivery of service. But I need you to know that we are really trying to give the best care that we can to our residents. Okay, so working under in a senior care, before the pandemic, I worked 2 jobs to get by. I worked full-time at my current facility, which is for a multinational company. And I worked part-time at another seniors home, which was part of the master healthcare agreement, the facilities bargaining agreement. My part-time job, which was under the facilities bargaining agreement, gave me access to a pension and better wages and benefits. But with the single site order, I choose the full-time hours at the lower paying private facility because the overall hours works better. The single site order did bump up my wages about $4 an hour at my full-time job, which is great. But I relied on wages from 2 places to get by, so that makes it difficult. Now I'm getting paid the same wage as I would be at the other facility, but my benefits are different. So why do we advocate for common wages and benefits? While I appreciate being paid more for the hourly rate, it's important moving forward to have common wages, benefits, and working conditions around the sector. If all of us have the same salary and benefits in long-term care, we wouldn't always be looking for greener pastures, which leads to high turnover of workers. There would be less movement in long-term care, and this would mean more stability for seniors and workers. Having a common wage and working conditions along long-term care wouldn't reduce turnover and be fair for everyone. We all do the same job and we all work really hard and we're just as at risk and we deserve to be treated in an equitable way. We all take care of residents and it shouldn't matter if you work for public or private facility. We all care. That is the most important. We all care for our residents. I think that's all that I can say for now.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Tess. And I want to take this moment to properly acknowledge the immense contribution that's being made by Tess and workers just like her on the front lines of seniors care. I also want to point out that these efforts to care for our elders are again being carried out largely by women, and a high proportion of those workers are workers of color. And they are at risk. Right now, just under 700 workers in seniors care have COVID-19. Some are experiencing the chronic symptoms that they just can't shake. Many have brought it home from their workplaces to their own families. This was their biggest fear since the beginning of this pandemic. And they are working under and like Tess just said, the immeasurable pressures of being short-staffed with significantly more responsibilities and workload that is required to do this incredibly important work safely. So this is the reality that's facing workers in this sector every single day during this pandemic. And Tess, and to all healthcare workers, just from the bottom of our hearts, thank you. Thank you for what you do. We're really counting on you for doing this. And you're doing it just tremendously. I can even say that Tess, in a moment of, like stress, even on Christmas Eve, when she should be celebrating with her family, she's emailing me and talking about the situation that she's going through. So she's very special, very dedicated lady. But here's the thing is that, these problems, definitely are exacerbated right now, but they started long before COVID-19 even came along. And I can say that one of the benefits of having a worker-friendly government is that when we have, panels like this talking about strong public services, is that, Minister Dix and I are going to have a lot of the same stories and a lot of same points of views on things. So I'm going to repeat a little bit of what he said, but kind of change the context a little bit and dig a little deeper in a couple of things. But I will try not to repeat too much. But we've said it already. COVID-19 really exposed the very fragile and fragmented system that we have here in BC. This is a system where government-funded care homes have widely varying wages and working conditions, where a care aide at one site earns $7 an hour less than a care aide just down the street doing the exact same work. And where this care aide has a pension and 18 sick days a year, the other care aide has less than half that amount of paid sick leave and no pension. So this didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't by accident. As Minister Dix pointed out, this is the result of nearly 2 decades of privatization and underinvestment by the former BC Liberal government. And so I'll briefly tell you about what happened so that we can identify what it is that we feel that needs to be done to fix it. So when the BC Liberals took power in 2001, almost all of the workers in funded long-term care at that time were covered by a single province-wide master agreement. So the same one covers that also covered all the hospital workers. And so that was the common standards that we had back then. And that was culmination of decades of organizing by our union, but also by our friends in BCGEU and other unions. And it was a powerful affirmation that working conditions were inseparable from caring conditions, and that there really should be a level playing field for workers in hospitals and in long-term care. But the BC Liberals systematically dismantled this level playing field piece by piece, and they did that primarily in 3 ways. One, through contracting out and contract flipping. Adrian Dix spoke of Bill 29 in 2002, removing contracting out protections. And that essentially meant that thousands of care and support workers in long-term care were fired and invited to reapply for their jobs at much lower wages, and certainly with fewer benefits. And then when the workers were reorganized, we would negotiate new collective agreements, and then the subcontracts were flipped and then flipped again. So firing the workers over and over, all in an effort to keep wages at those rock bottom levels and keep the unions out. Secondly, it was through de-accreditation. So some care home operators were offered a special deal by the BC Liberals, an opportunity to opt out of or de-accredit from the public sector bargaining agent, which means they were no longer bound by the provincial master agreement. And then thirdly, they subsidized and funded all new care homes outside of that provincial master agreement. So again, like Minister Dix said, all of these laws and policies left us with this fragmented long-term care system in terms of standards, in terms of labor rights, in terms of wages and working conditions, and of course, in terms of staffing. So that's how we got into this serious recruitment and retention crisis that was only made worse by COVID. So those low wages forced workers, as Tess mentioned, it forced them to hold multiple jobs to put together a living wage for their families, but also to abandon their lower paid position for better paying jobs when the post would come up for a regular position. So the result wasn't just, that people had to work at several places, but it was also a high turnover of staff. And of course, that meant a disruption to the critical care relationships that were with the residents. All of this left the seniors care system stressed, understaffed, deeply challenged to deal with a once in a generation health emergency. But here's the good thing. The public sees this now. The pandemic has shown us, Canada-wide, about how this system is undervalued, under-resourced, and understaffed. And that is so critical that we notice this now because this is our chance to fix it. At no time in any of our history that the public has ever been so focused and so incensed as they are right now on this particular sector. So I want to give kudos to our NDP government, give you full credit, Minister Dix, for some of the really, really important steps that you took to move us in the right direction already. Starting with, you listened to workers. You made changes to the labor code that protected jobs, wages, and collective agreements when care operators flip subcontracts. That has stopped. That practice is over. You've invested in hundreds of millions of dollars before the pandemic and even during, and that again is unprecedented. This is significant programs to bring in more care staff into this stress system and eventually to improve, again, the number of hours of care that the residents receive. You've also stepped in where needed to take over the administration for for-profit care homes that failed to deliver necessary care to their residents. And of course, I can't go without mentioning, again, you've repealed Bill 29 and 94, that two pieces of legislation that deprived workers of collective bargaining rights and aided in that privatization of health services. And I can tell you, Minister Dix, that is definitely one of our members' proudest days as well. So this pandemic has been devastating. But it has definitely forced us to act more quickly to address ongoing inequities in the long-term care system. And some of these changes we know are going to be permanent. For example, the Provincial Health Office's single site order limiting the long-term care and assisted living workers to one site. We understand that this is a permanent change to have those wages leveled up to the public sector rate. And that's really, really important. I can't understate how important this is because that ensured low-waged care home operators did not lose their workforce to higher payer employers during this pandemic. So that would have been an even more severe staffing crisis, if that had happened. And let's be honest, leveling up wouldn't have been necessary if we had a common agreement in this sector as we did 20 years ago. So we've been calling for this restoration of standard wages, benefits, and working conditions under a common collective agreement for years. And during this last election, Premier Horgan promised to do just that. As a bridging measure, the leveled up wages, will be maintained post-pandemic. That's been mandated in the health minister's letter to carry out this commitment. And we've also been calling on government to develop a capital plan to reinvest in public and nonprofit care homes. And again, Minister Dix spoke of that as well. These are really important commitments going forward, but we do need more. We need to establish some clear enforceable standards in our long-term care and assisted living sector, not just guidelines. We need to ensure that we have staffing levels in place that will improve care and reduce injuries to workers in what are BC's most dangerous workplaces. We need a commitment from the federal government to invest in long-term care and tie this investment to national standards. Now, there's a lot of debate about what that looks like. As a standalone legislation or the Canada Health Act, doesn't matter, it needs to happen. And we need to phase out the profit motive in our seniors care facilities. Subjecting these operators to more stringent accountability measures for their funding that they received is a welcome start. But we need to end public subsidies for for-profit care construction going forward. So I just want to end by expressing again my deep, deep gratitude and respect for all of those working on the front lines in our seniors' care homes. They are doing extraordinary work for our most vulnerable citizens in the most difficult circumstances you can imagine. And one thing that each and every one of you can do to support their work is follow the provincial health guidelines. Our respected elders and these workers who care for them deserve dignified working and caring conditions, and they need you to do your part as well to keep them safe. So thanks everybody, thanks Amandeep, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Barb, for fighting for working people, especially for those in the healthcare sector. Your voice is really appreciated, and thank you to Tess as well for doing the same thing as well. So as we're wrapping up the webinar, we're going to the next part of this webinar, which is we will be taking questions directly from you folks at home. So don't forget, there's that bubble at the bottom of your screen where we will take your questions if they come along, but we do have some questions that have popped up. So I'm going to be asking both or all the panelists, and we'll start off with you, Minister Dix, if you wanted to answer first, and we can go on to you, over to you, Barb. So provinces have very different pandemics, and many people have said that we should have national standards for long-term care. I know that you folks did talk a little bit about it, but what do you each think of that?
Well, first of all, and that's where I'm going to disagree a little bit with Larry. We have a Canada Health Act now, we do. But the current services that are in the Canada Health Act have not been adequately funded for a long time by federal governments, right? So the consequence of that is felt not just in health policies, but across government policies, right? So when Premier Horgan goes to federal provincial conferences and says we need to fund the existing services in the existing Canada Health Act, which are funded below the levels the federal government agreed to initially, and way below the 50-50 level, which was the initial basis of the act, that's serious business. So when the federal government wants to talk about applying the Canada Health Act or applying national standards to new areas of healthcare, the fact is the existing areas of healthcare are not adequately supported now, and that has its impact on everything. And you see that now. So I think from a provincial government perspective, from our perspective, the first thing the federal government needs to do is fund the Canada Health Act, the current Canada Health Act, and that's precisely what Premier Hogan's been saying we should do. And that affects everything else that healthcare does, primary care and hospital care, and all those sectors of the healthcare system that are so important. And they also will allow, should the healthcare system be equitably drawn, to support other things that affect the social determinants of health. Because right now, our existing healthcare system, I think most people would agree, we're not in just one public health emergency, we're in two, with the overdose crisis, requires, and with an aging society, requires the federal government to live up to its historical word around the Canada Health Act. And so that's for starters. That's before we start talking about new investments. We have to start talking about people ensuring that the investments and the commitments that we've made that are in the Canada Health Act now are backed up by appropriate levels of federal funding. And so, with respect to the rest of it, I would say that I'm open to everything. But I would say this, that again, we think we have a very progressive agenda to put forward in BC, and we're looking for ways to make things better now, right? And so that we're also not going to let the perfect stand in the way of the possible. And if there are opportunities to improve the long-term care system, or the home support system, or the seniors care system, or the surgery system, or the primary care system, or our hospital sector, or our mental health and addictions supports, that we're going to take those opportunities, And I think there's been, Barb's right, there's been a lot of discussion of long-term care, and undoubtedly the system needs more support, and that's why we've made massive investments since we got to office, and are making massive investments in long-term care in this pandemic. But our support for the healthcare system has to go beyond the 30,000 people working in long-term care to all the people who need supports, both for the social determinants of health and health in the system. So, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. And if the federal government showed up and said we're prepared to fund improvements in long-term care, of course we would be part of that. But in the meantime, we got to make improvements here as well now. And I'm not going to let the problems with that process get in the way of us making improvements now on the very issues we talked about: capital and support for workers and improvements in the current system. Final thing I just say is this, that we've been working with everybody. We have a system that is what it is today, which is a public system with public contracts or contracted people working in it, and health authority owned and operated people. So we haven't been, we've been working with everyone in the pandemic, because healthcare workers work for everyone, and you don't have a choice as a senior. Really, you've got a little bit of choice. It's one of the changes we made. You have to have one bed, first available bed. Now you have some limited choice in where you can go. These are all public beds. You don't really have that much of a choice in many communities as to whether you go to a private provider or a public provider. So our job is to make sure standards are high across the system, and that's what we're doing. So the short answer is I've heard a lot of talk from Ottawa, and throne speech talk, about childcare, about pharmacare. There's been throne speech talk for a couple of generations, but I'm also really committed to making changes now.
Okay, great, thank you. Barb, over to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate Minister Dix bringing up the funding issue, because that absolutely is really, really critical, and has been for a very long time. At one point in time, really the goal in these transfer funds for health services from the federal government to the provinces was supposed to be a 50-50 cost share. But that got completely, totally, utterly gutted. And then eventually it was a federal Liberal government that, they knew they cut too low. So they brought in the 10-year health accord, which was meant to increase those transfer funds. Long story short, after that 10 years was up, that stopped, and we never did reach the levels of funding that we were, we were meant to, and we were designed to actually have that level of funding. So that is definitely a significant issue, and one that our union specifically, I can say QP National, worked really, really hard on reinstating that health accord. So the fight for continued increased funding will continue, and we'll join the province on that piece. But I think one thing that's really, really important, we are so fortunate to have a progressive government here that, wants to protect public services, understands the social determinants of health, is really, the ultimate, way of preventing increased healthcare and seniors care's costs. But I think it's really important for us to understand that we're not all in the same boat here. Alberta is, they have a provincial government that is about to do what happened to us here in BC, nearly 20 years ago. And national standards would prevent these provincial, right-wing governments for really from peeling away and chunking away and then ultimately ripping away, standards that should be in these long-term care homes. And again, we've always seen it. We've known that there's been a critical problem in the sector right across this country. But I mean, there's never been a better time to fix it. This government, our government, has done a tremendous job so far. We definitely have some ways to go. And I'm just really, really grateful that we've been able to have those conversations and work with the government to make sure that it's going in the right direction. So again, thanks to Minister Dix.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll go on to the next question. We'll just dig right in. How can we ensure that we have a sufficient number of trained staff in long-term, given that our population is aging so fast? I'm going to let you answer that first, Barbara, since Adrian answered the last question first.
Oh, that's such a great question. Simply because, I mean, it's been a longstanding problem, but I actually almost wish you had gone to Minister Dix first, because they actually have like quite a significant plan that started even before the pandemic. The critical short staffing in this sector has been a problem for quite some time, and they tackled it fairly early on. So I'll actually just hand it over to Minister Dix.
Yeah, I think what it shows is the real challenge here, that it's very difficult to simply sort of turn on a dime and look back at a long period of BC's history, where people such as care aides, but also nursing staff, people who kept our long-term care homes clean and provided food services and everything else, were treated with disrespect. And people know in a society when work is respected and when it isn't, and it has consequences for their decisions. And so what's challenging about our healthcare workforce, as your question suggests, is we're going to have more demand because we have an aging population. Inevitably, we require more long-term care beds. We need to remediate existing long-term care beds, and we need to provide services to people at higher standards. And if the pandemic has shown anything, it shows that those policies are broadly supported and broadly needed in the society, right? So you're doing that at a time when there's been very little investment in training. There's not been insufficient investment in training, and where the work has been disrespected, right? So how do you deal with it? Pretty simple, more training spaces. We have a plan to hire 7,000 healthcare workers to sort of put us on the right path to both allow us to increase and improve standards during the pandemic and thereafter in public long-term care, but also in assisted living and in home support and other areas which require that, which will be needed. But this particular thing is for long-term care. And then you have to treat workers fairly. It has real consequences, and people throw their hands up and they say, sometimes I think on the political right, and have said, isn't it shocking we don't have enough workers, having treated people poorly for a very long period of time, right? So you need to treat workers with respect. You need to work with the sector, and we are, and that means working with all elements of the sector, the nonprofit, the for-profit, the health authority owned and operated, the universities, the colleges, the training institutes, the unions, together to put together a plan that works. And the plan has to be a national in scope, because you've got to have a provincial plan, and then you've got to work together with the federal government to see that you have a labor force plan that makes sense. So you need all of those things. So those are the things you need, and those are some of the things that we're doing here in BC. But it's a real challenge because as the society ages, our healthcare workforce has also aged. And so it has helped that we've moved a lot of people from part-time to full-time work over the last 3 years. But the reality is, it's an older workforce working in long-term care. It is hard work. And you don't have to look at any work-safe statistics to know that it's hard work, and it's the potential for injury is high. So we need a new generation of healthcare workers, and you do it by respecting the work, ensuring that people are paid adequately, and creating enough training and celebrate the sector, celebrate the work, celebrate the workers, and not diminish and disrespect them. That's a start. It's not the whole answer, but it's a start.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, M&D, that yeah, so it's really critical to open up the spaces for the training, and that again, this government is doing through the healthcare assistance, healthcare access program. But nonetheless, I think it's just really it's just important to reiterate about how important it is to create a sector that is something that people want to join, something that people want to work in. And of course, absolutely, you know, it's about respecting the workers through wages, through benefits, but also through job security. It's absolutely imperative that, you know, people being able to access full-time work, access sick time when they need it. It's the whole gamut. It has to be attractive for people to come work in it.
Thank you for that. So we'll take another question. And so someone asked, what support is there for workers that get sick from or are exposed to COVID on the job? There's been stories of WorkSafe only paying wage loss for 2 weeks after a positive test. I will pass it over to you first, Minister Dix.
Well, I think this is the part in British Columbia, and you know that two things on sick leave. One, that Premier Horgan has been a leader in wanting to expand sick leave, not just to workers in BC, but to workers everywhere. We have a situation where we're asking people to stay home when they're sick, and the lack of protections leads to a kind of forced presenteeism for many workers, right? Secondly, it shows the importance of unions, right? Because how you're treated with respect to sick pay in BC, in many respects depends on whether you have a collective agreement or not. And so that's why you see the very different treatment of different workers, even within the same sector, depending on whether they're unionized or not. And I think that for a long time, you know, we've talked about a polarization of political debate, and people have forgotten, I think, in a society where on the private sector side we've seen less and less unionization, why unions are so valuable. And in a pandemic, you see pretty clearly why. It means that people are allowed to stay home when they're sick from an economic point of view, and that makes a huge difference. So what we need, I think, nationally is our sick pay systems that protect all workers, and that's what Premier Horgan's been driving, and that's what the federal government has promised. But ultimately, I think that these worker issues also have to be addressed in collective agreements, and that these are the important things to negotiate in collective agreements. And we're not going to be in a pandemic forever, we hope. It feels like forever about now, I have to tell you. And I know it feels like forever for Tess and her colleagues as well. Like it feels like forever, right? And but I think some of the lessons of the pandemic about long-term care, about the importance of sick leave and the importance of unions, I think we need to tell that story, and we need to tell it and tell it again, so that because ultimately we need to empower people to defend their own rights, to expand their own rights, and they can't just be given by government, because when they're given by government, sometimes they can be taken away by other governments. We need to create circumstances where we have strong institutions, and we have them, unions, to protect workers regardless of the political circumstances, and to ensure that the basic rights that we'd expect everyone would do, we'd expect our brother and our sister and our parents and our children to have, those rights are given to everybody.
Yeah, so I'll just add that, you know, again, this is why common standards is so important. The sick time benefits throughout the entire system is pretty dramatically different. So this, I mean, it's absolutely join a union. That's your first and foremost answer, but it's not always, the whole answer. We definitely need to go back to those common standards. But I just want to say too that, when it comes to the WCB, I mean, you only get it if you test positive. So, so your sick time gets used up, especially during this time. Got a sniffle, might be allergies, doesn't matter. Use your sick time. You got burnout, you use your sick time. Got COVID or any other health concern, you're using up your sick time. So people are really burning through their sick banks fast if they're fortunate enough to have that. And some, again, as private long-term care sites have very, very little sick time. So it's definitely something. It's not just healthcare workers, it's all workers. We all benefit as a society when we have sick time. So I just can't stress enough, though, that it's those common standards that we really, really need to make sure that all workers in the long-term care sector are protected adequately.
Thank you for that. Now, we're close to time, so we will be wrapping up the webinar. But before we wrap up and I pass it back over to Orion, I wanted to just highlight that this was our first Monday night political session. So it was a success, and thank you for everyone attending. But we have 3 more sessions coming up on Monday, and they are pandemic recovery and good jobs, the opioid crisis, and what labor can do to help, and the impact of COVID on women. So you can register for those, just how you folks registered for this. So I will be passing it on to Orion.
Yeah, I just thank you very much, Amandeep, and a big thank you to all the panel members, Minister Dix, Barb, and Tess. Just it's great to have you come on and talk about this very important issue. I know very few people who have not been impacted some way with the long-term care and relatives in long-term care over the COVID crisis. And again, just echo Barb's thank to all the healthcare workers like Tess and all the work that they've done operating under incredibly difficult circumstances and really providing above and beyond care for those residents who really are the most vulnerable and are just sitting there hoping. So thank you again. I also do want to echo what Minister Dix says about politics and the importance of it. We're likely to look at a federal election here sometime this year, depending on who you listen to, anytime between March and September. And I think Minister Dix really did highlight some of the promises that have been made for a long time on the federal level, and the importance of electing a government that actually will fulfill its promises as opposed to just making them over and over again. And so just keep that in mind when the federal election comes. A whole bunch of parties will be asking for your votes. A whole bunch of promises will be made by parties that have made them before. I just want to maybe consider that when you cast your ballot. I do want to leave folks with one more short video of another HEU worker that talked about some of the impacts of the previous government and also COVID. So I'll play that and then I'll sign off. But big thank you for everybody that attended. It was wonderful to see the panel members virtually, and it's great to see a whole bunch of names in the attendee channel. So thank you very much again. I'll get this video started, and then once it's done, the webinar will shut down. Oh, maybe I should take my own how to run a Zoom meeting course that I run. There we go.
I was a new mother. I just came back from my maternity leave, and we found out that we were laid off. I was so devastated. Because of the busy liberal contract flipping, I was forced to reapply for the same job at a much lower wage. But I just have to accept what they offer because I need to feed my family. The busy liberals made a choice. They just ignored long-term care for 16 years. What they did is not fair for our seniors. Some care aides were forced to work multiple jobs in order to survive. So I think that is one reason why when the pandemic started, the long-term care centers were vulnerable. We were all really scared. Workers were going place to place and they were being exposed to the virus. I was worried I could bring the virus home to my family or pass it on to the seniors. So when the government made the single site order, it meant a lot for the seniors. We were not allowed to work for many care homes anymore. Because of that, they were more protected from the virus. The pandemic has shown us long-term care needs to be better for our seniors. The NDP has already done so much. They banned contract flipping and are working to fix problems in long-term care. As a British Columbian and as a care aide, I want seniors to have a better care. I want a government that puts people first.
So thank you again, everybody. Have a good evening and stay safe.